Our story begins at the dawn of the second millennium, when Europe was a continent of kingdoms and seafaring warriors, and the Atlantic Ocean was a vast, uncharted expanse. In the far north, among the icy fjords of Greenland, Norse communities survived in a harsh, frozen landscape, eking out lives from the sea and the land. These people were not idle dreamers. They were explorers, traders, and warriors, hardened by storms, hunger, and the relentless northern winds. Among them was Leif Erikson, son of the famed Eric the Red, who had himself carved out a precarious life on Greenland after being exiled from Iceland. The Norse had long been masters of the ocean, navigating in sturdy, clinker-built ships that could withstand Atlantic storms. These ships, with their single square sails and oar-propelled hulls, allowed them to traverse seas that terrified the rest of Europe. Driven by stories of distant lands rich in resources, Leif Erikson and his crew set sail westward, guided by the sun, stars, and the knowledge passed down from generations of seafarers. Around the year 1000 CE, after weeks of perilous sailing, they sighted land, green, rugged, and unlike anything they had known in Greenland. They named it Vinland, a term evocative of wild grapes, suggesting fertile soil and bountiful resources. The sagas, specifically the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, provide the earliest written accounts of this moment. These texts, though written decades later, offer vivid descriptions: forests dense with timber, rivers teeming with fish, and the land's potential for grazing livestock. Vinland was a world apart, promising opportunity and danger in equal measure. The Norse established temporary settlements along the coast, constructing simple wooden houses and clearing small plots of land for cultivation. Archaeological evidence, such as the site at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, confirms the presence of these settlers and provides tangible proof of their craftsmanship and ingenuity. Houses were built using sod and timber, hearths burned for warmth, and iron tools were forged from scraps salvaged from previous voyages or imported from Greenland. Life in Vinland, however, was never easy. Winters were harsh, supplies from Greenland were inconsistent, and the small Norse community faced constant uncertainty. Beyond survival, the Norse encountered the indigenous peoples of the region, whom they referred to as Skrælings. The sagas describe initial curiosity, trade, and occasional conflict. The Norse brought with them tools, cloth, and iron items, which they traded for furs, food, and knowledge of the land. Yet cultural misunderstandings and competition for resources quickly led to tensions. Skirmishes were reported, some minor, others more dangerous, as neither side fully understood the intentions of the other. These interactions were brief but crucial. They represent the first documented contact between Europeans and the peoples of what is now Canada, a contact that would have echoes centuries later. Despite the promise of Vinland, the settlements were short-lived. The harsh environment, logistical difficulties, and intermittent conflict with indigenous communities made permanent occupation untenable. The Norse eventually abandoned Vinland, returning to Greenland and Iceland, leaving behind only traces of their brief presence. Yet this abandonment does not diminish the historical significance of these voyages. Vinland marked the first recorded European footprint on Canadian soil, predating Columbus by nearly 5 centuries. It established a precedent. The land now called Canada was no longer unknown to Europeans, and its resources, climate, and challenges had been documented, even if only partially. The legacy of the Norse in Vinland is multifaceted. On one hand, it demonstrates the remarkable navigational and survival skills of the Norse people, who braved unknown waters in search of new lands. On the other hand, it highlights the ephemeral nature of early European contact with the Americas, a theme that would repeat with later explorers, settlers, and colonizers. The Norse voyages were not about empire building or conquest. They were acts of curiosity, ambition, and survival, driven by human desire to explore beyond the horizon. In the broader tapestry of Canadian history, Vinland occupies a unique space. It is a starting point, a first entry in the long ledger of recorded events. From these initial, tentative steps, centuries later, explorers like John Cabot and Jacques Cartier would arrive, driven not merely by curiosity, but by trade, politics, and empire. Yet the Norse presence reminds us that Canada's history did not begin in Europe's imagination in the 15th century. It had already been touched by Europeans who dared to cross the Atlantic long before nations or borders existed. Today, Vinland is remembered not for the size of its settlements or the duration of occupation, but for what it represents: human daring, the unknown, and the beginning of recorded history in Canada. Archaeologists continue to study the remains at L'Anse aux Meadows, uncovering tools, remnants of houses, and evidence of ironworking, all of which illuminate the lives of these early explorers. Historians cross-reference these findings with Norse sagas to create a richer, more nuanced picture of this remarkable era. The Norse in Vinland teach us several enduring lessons. They reveal the resilience and adaptability of humans in extreme environments, the potential and limits of early exploration, and the complex dynamics between newcomers and established communities. In this case, the Indigenous peoples of the region. Their story underscores the interplay between ambition and reality, a theme that will echo throughout Canadian history, as European powers, settlers, and Indigenous nations continually negotiated, clashed, and adapted to the vast and often unforgiving landscape. In the grand narrative of Canada, the year 1000 CE stands as a symbolic and recorded beginning. It marks a moment when human curiosity first etched itself onto the shores of the continent, when tales of distant lands were woven into the sagas of a northern people, and when the stage was set for centuries of exploration, settlement, and conflict. It is a reminder that history is not only about conquest or empire. It is about people venturing into the unknown, leaving footprints, and shaping the story that future generations would tell. As we move forward in this documentary, from Vinland to the rise of permanent settlements, from fleeting Norse adventures to the complex societies of New France and British North America, we trace a path of ambition, struggle, and identity. The story of Canada begins not with the formation of a nation, but with the courage of a few sailors who dared to cross the ocean, face the unknown, and leave a mark on the land that would one day become a country. And that mark, though faint, is indelible, recorded in sagas, unearthed in archaeological sites, and remembered as the first chapter in the entire history of Canada. Nearly 5 centuries after the fleeting Norse settlements in Vinland, European attention returned to the coasts of what is now Canada. By the late 15th century, Europe was undergoing a profound transformation. The Renaissance had rekindled curiosity, innovation, and ambition, and the age of discovery was in full swing. Nations competed to chart unknown waters, claim distant lands, and unlock the wealth of the New World. It was in this context that John Cabot, an Italian navigator sailing under the English flag, embarked on a voyage that would reconnect Europe with the lands first glimpsed by the Norse. In 1497, Cabot set sail from Bristol with a small, sturdy ship, navigating the treacherous North Atlantic. Unlike the Norse, whose voyages had been motivated by settlement and survival, Cabot sailed with purpose, to find a northwest route to Asia and secure riches for his sponsors. After weeks battling storms, ice, and uncertainty, Cabot and his crew reached the eastern shores of what is widely believed to be Newfoundland. While no Norse settlements remained to greet them, the land was rich in promise: dense forests, abundant fish, and the potential for trade with indigenous peoples. Cabot claimed the territory for England, establishing a legal and symbolic foothold that would resonate for centuries. Cabot's arrival marked the beginning of sustained European interest in Canada's Atlantic coast. Unlike the Norse, whose settlements were ephemeral, Cabot's voyage was part of a broader European movement driven by commerce, exploration, and empire. England, along with Portugal, Spain, and France, now turned their gaze to the icy waters and temperate shores of northeastern North America. This period set the stage for seasonal fishing settlements, early trade networks, and eventual colonization. The 16th century saw the rise of French and Basque fishermen along the Atlantic seaboard. The rich waters of the Grand Banks, teeming with cod, attracted fleets that sailed each spring from Europe to exploit these resources. These fishermen established temporary camps along the coast, often returning year after year to process and dry their catch for European markets. The seasonal settlements were modest, simple shelters, smokehouses for curing fish, and rudimentary storage facilities. Yet, they served as the first points of consistent European presence in what would become Canada. Interactions with Indigenous peoples were central to these early encounters. Indigenous communities had inhabited these lands for millennia, developing sophisticated systems of hunting, fishing, and governance. The Europeans, arriving with unfamiliar tools, metals, and textiles, were both a curiosity and a potential threat. Trade emerged as a key component of early relations. Indigenous peoples exchanged furs, food, and knowledge of the land for knives, cloth, iron implements, and other goods from Europe. These exchanges were complex, often mutually beneficial, but not without tension. Misunderstandings, differing worldviews, and competition for resources sometimes led to conflict, foreshadowing the more violent encounters of later centuries. Disease, an invisible but devastating factor, also shaped these early contacts. Europeans carried pathogens such as smallpox and influenza, which indigenous populations had no immunity against. Even in these early years, outbreaks began to disrupt communities, reduce populations, and alter traditional social structures. While trade and diplomacy defined many of these interactions, disease was a silent but powerful force reshaping the land long before European settlements became permanent. Exploration during this period was not limited to the coasts. French explorers began charting rivers, bays, and inlets, mapping the terrain with increasing precision. They sought routes into the interior to expand trade networks, particularly for furs, which had become a highly valuable commodity in European markets. These expeditions laid the groundwork for the later establishment of New France, revealing the vast potential of the St. Lawrence River system, the Great Lakes, and surrounding territories. Religious and political motives were intertwined with commerce. Europe was a continent of competing kingdoms and faiths. Catholic France and Protestant England, among others, sought to extend their influence abroad. Missionaries accompanied some voyages, aiming to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. These efforts, while limited in impact initially, would intensify in subsequent decades, intertwining spiritual ambition with economic and political goals. The lives of these early explorers and fishermen were harsh. Months at sea tested their endurance. Storms threatened to capsize their ships. Freezing winds chilled them to the bone, and limited provisions challenged their survival. On land, the forests and rivers were unfamiliar, wildlife could be dangerous, and winter promised isolation and scarcity. Despite these hardships, Europe's expansionist drive and desire for profit ensured that these voyages continued year after year. Seasonal settlements also contributed to the development of knowledge about navigation, geography, and indigenous cultures. Maps became more accurate, detailing bays, capes, rivers, and islands. Knowledge of tides, currents, and wind patterns improved, making voyages slightly safer and more predictable. Observations of local flora, fauna, and natural resources informed later settlement plans, revealing which areas could support agriculture, fishing, or fur trading posts. By the end of the 16th century, these explorations had set the stage for a permanent European presence. While the Norse had left behind fleeting settlements, and Cabot had planted the flag of England symbolically, it was the seasonal fishermen and early explorers who created the networks, knowledge, and incentives that would lead to enduring colonization. French claims, particularly in the St. Lawrence Valley, became increasingly important as France recognized the economic potential of furs, fisheries, and trade alliances with indigenous nations. The early European explorers of 1497 to 1600 did more than map coastlines or chase profit. They transformed the cultural, economic, and ecological landscape of what would become Canada. Their arrival initiated a series of profound changes. The introduction of European goods and technology shifts in indigenous trade and political structures. The spread of disease and the gradual integration of these northern territories into the broader currents of European politics and commerce. These centuries were not yet defined by permanent colonies or cities, but by contact, curiosity, and cautious engagement with a new and vast land. By the close of the 16th century, the stage was set for the next chapter, the founding of permanent settlements, the emergence of trade alliances, and the formal establishment of European colonial administration. Figures such as Jacques Cartier would soon sail into the St. Lawrence River, charting paths that would shape centuries of Canadian history. But it was this earlier period, between 1497 and 1600, that laid the foundation. It was a time of adventure, danger, cultural exchange, and first contact, a critical bridge between the fleeting Norse presence of Vinland and the enduring European colonies that would follow. In reflecting on this era, one sees the beginnings of patterns that would define Canadian history for centuries. The interplay of European ambition and Indigenous agency. The importance of natural resources and the transformative impact of human contact across oceans and cultures. It was a period of experimentation, risk, and adaptation, where the vast northern lands were first documented and understood, not through empire, but through survival, curiosity, and commerce. The story of early European exploration is, in essence, a story of human curiosity meeting a new world. From Cabot's daring voyage to the seasonal fishing settlements along the Atlantic coast, these events marked the first steps in a journey that would eventually create the nation we know today. They remind us that history is a tapestry of exploration, encounter, and consequence, and that even temporary or tentative presence can leave an enduring imprint on the land and on the story of a people. The turn of the 17th century marked a pivotal shift in the history of what would one day become Canada. The age of seasonal exploration and fleeting fishing camps was giving way to something more enduring. It was a time when the French crown, driven by ambition, commerce, and religious mission, began to envision permanent settlements across the vast North American continent. Central to this effort was a man whose name would become inseparable from the early history of Canada, Samuel de Champlain. In 1608, Champlain founded the settlement of Quebec on the rocky shores of the St. Lawrence River. Strategically positioned on a high bluff overlooking the river, the location provided a natural defense against both rival European powers and potential hostile forces. Yet it was also practical. The river served as a vital artery into the interior, offering access to rich forests, waterways, and, most importantly, the lucrative fur trade. The establishment of Quebec marked the birth of New France, the first permanent European colony in Canada, and the beginning of a new chapter in the continent's recorded history. Champlain was not merely a founder of settlements. He was a navigator, diplomat, cartographer, and chronicler. He meticulously mapped the region, recording rivers, lakes, forests, and settlements of indigenous peoples. His maps became essential tools for future explorers, for traders, and military campaigns. Yet Champlain's vision extended beyond geography. He understood that the survival and growth of New France depended on alliances with indigenous nations. The Huron-Wendat, a powerful confederacy in the Great Lakes region, became Champlain's first major allies. Through diplomacy, marriage alliances, and shared military ventures, Champlain forged bonds that were both practical and symbolic. These alliances facilitated trade, particularly in furs, and provided crucial military support against rival groups and European adversaries. The French understood that without indigenous cooperation, the colony could not survive the harsh winters, disease, and the threat of hostile neighbors. Trade, especially in beaver pelts, became the economic backbone of New France. European demand for furs was immense, driven by fashion in France and across the continent. Indigenous trappers brought pelts to trading posts along the St. Lawrence River, exchanging them for metal tools, beads, cloth, and other goods. This commerce transformed both European and indigenous societies. Indigenous communities became integrated into wider trade networks, while French settlers relied increasingly on indigenous knowledge of the land, rivers, and hunting practices. Life in Quebec was precarious. The settlers faced long, bitter winters, scarce food supplies, and the constant threat of illness. Champlain and his companions built sturdy wooden and stone structures, established small farms, and sought to cultivate the land despite its rocky terrain. Fishing and hunting supplemented agriculture, while trade with indigenous nations provided critical resources. Yet survival required resilience, adaptation, and cooperation. Each year brought new challenges: flooding rivers, harsh winters, and the unpredictability of relations with neighboring nations. Religion played a central role in New France. Missionaries, primarily Jesuits, arrived to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. They documented indigenous beliefs and practices, often with admiration, but also with the intent to reshape local spiritual life. Churches and missions became centers not only of faith, but also of learning, governance, and cultural exchange. Religion is intertwined with politics, commerce, and daily life, shaping the colony's identity and providing a moral framework for settlers navigating the hardships of the new land. French exploration expanded rapidly under Champlain's guidance. He journeyed upriver and across lakes, forging alliances and mapping territories far beyond Quebec. These expeditions often involved long treks through dense forests, over treacherous rapids, and across frozen landscapes in winter. Champlain's skill as a negotiator and chronicler allowed him to navigate complex relationships among indigenous nations, balancing diplomacy, trade interests, and strategic alliances. His writings provide some of the earliest detailed accounts of the interior regions of North America, including the St. Lawrence Valley, the Ottawa River, and the Great Lakes. The colony of New France grew slowly but steadily. By the mid-17th century, small settlements dotted the St. Lawrence River, including Trois-Rivières and Montreal, each serving as hubs for trade, agriculture, and governance. The French crown recognized the importance of formal administration. Governors, military officers, and officials were appointed to oversee the colony, ensuring order, defending territory, and regulating trade. This combination of local governance and imperial oversight would define New France's structure for decades. Conflict and competition were never far from the settlers' daily lives. New France existed in a world of contested spaces where European rivals and indigenous nations vied for resources and strategic advantage. Encounters with the Iroquois Confederacy, who were aligned with Dutch and later English interests, often escalated into violent confrontations. Champlain himself participated in battles alongside Huron allies, using European weapons, including muskets, to tip the scales. These skirmishes, while small in scale compared to later wars, shaped the alliances and rivalries that would dominate the region for generations. Despite these challenges, New France persisted and began to develop a distinct culture. French settlers brought language, law, and customs that would survive through centuries of colonial upheaval. They cultivated relationships with indigenous peoples, learned survival skills from local communities, and adapted European practices to the North American environment. Families established farms, children grew up bilingual in French and local languages, and communities became interconnected networks of trade, kinship, and diplomacy. The period from 1608 to 1663 also witnessed the formalization of French colonial policy. The French crown recognized the strategic and economic value of New France, granting charters and authority to colonial governors. Settlers were encouraged to maintain strong defenses, expand trade, and foster alliances. This imperial attention solidified New France's status as a permanent colony, differentiating it from earlier seasonal settlements or exploratory ventures. Champlain's death in 1635 did not halt the colony's growth. Successive governors continued his work, expanding trade networks, exploring further into the interior, and navigating the intricate relationships with indigenous nations. By 1663, New France had become a thriving, if still small, colony with a growing population, structured governance, and a network of trade routes that connected the St. Lawrence Valley to the vast interior of the continent. Throughout this period, the interplay between European ambition and indigenous agency defined the colony. Indigenous nations were not passive participants. They negotiated, traded, and at times resisted, shaping the patterns of settlement, warfare, and diplomacy. Their knowledge of the land, rivers, and resources was indispensable to the survival and prosperity of New France. European settlers relied on this guidance, and in turn, the introduction of European goods and technologies altered indigenous societies. By 1663, the foundations of New France were firmly established. Quebec, Montreal, and Trois-Rivières formed the core settlements. Trade networks linked the colony to indigenous territories, and French law, language, and religion were embedded in daily life. This period laid the groundwork for the expansion, conflict, and cultural development that would characterize New France for the next century. It marked a transition from exploration to colonization, from seasonal presence to permanent settlement, and from isolated adventurers to a structured society with political, economic, and cultural institutions. By the mid-17th century, New France had moved beyond its fragile beginnings to become a colony of strategic, economic, and cultural importance. Yet with growth came challenges, rivalries with other European powers, persistent resistance from indigenous nations, and the pressures of survival in a vast and often unforgiving land. The period from 1663 to 1763 was one of both expansion and conflict, a century that would define the identity of New France and shape the trajectory of Canada's history for generations to come. In 1663, King Louis XIV of France transformed New France into a royal colony, taking direct control from private companies that had struggled to manage the distant territory. The king appointed a governor to oversee military and diplomatic affairs, an intendant to administer justice, finance, and trade, and a bishop to guide the spiritual life of the settlers. This centralization of authority brought stability and organization, enabling the colony to grow more systematically. Settlements such as Montreal, Quebec, and Trois-Rivières became hubs of commerce, governance, and cultural life. The fur trade remained the backbone of New France's economy. Beaver pelts, highly prized in Europe for hats and clothing, drove exploration and diplomacy. French traders, known as coureurs de bois and later voyageurs, ventured deep into forests and waterways, often traveling hundreds of kilometers from the settlements to trade directly with indigenous trappers. These men became vital intermediaries, navigating both rivers and political alliances with skill and daring. Their voyages opened new trade routes, mapped unknown territories, and brought European goods, knives, firearms, cloth, and metal tools into indigenous economies. Yet the prosperity of New France was inseparable from conflict. The colony faced continuous pressure from British colonies to the south, whose expansion and mercantile ambitions directly threatened French interests. Armed clashes erupted over territory, trade dominance, and alliances with indigenous nations. Perhaps the most enduring and significant of these conflicts was the series of wars between the French and the Iroquois Confederacy, whose control over strategic regions of the St. Lawrence Valley and Great Lakes posed both economic and military challenges. Champlain's successors were forced to maintain a delicate balance, engaging in military campaigns while also securing trade and diplomacy to prevent total destabilization of the colony. The French also competed with the British and Dutch over North American territory. Throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries, wars in Europe spilled over into the colonies, including King William's War, 1689 to 1697, Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, and King George's War, 1744 to 1748. These conflicts were fought in distant forests and rivers, with European officers, militia, indigenous allies, and settlers caught in the complex web of imperial ambitions. Forts were built along key waterways: Fort Frontenac, Fort Niagara, and Fort Michilimackinac, to assert control, protect trade, and provide staging points for military campaigns. Indigenous nations were central to these struggles. The French relied heavily on their alliances with the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, and other nations, who provided warriors, guidance, and knowledge of the terrain. Conversely, the Iroquois Confederacy, aligned at times with the British, resisted French expansion through raids, diplomacy, and strategic warfare. These alliances were neither permanent nor simple. Indigenous nations pursued their own interests, negotiated, switched sides, and leveraged European rivalries to protect territory and access trade goods. Understanding New France's growth requires recognizing that it was not a purely European enterprise. It was a hybrid space shaped by negotiation, conflict, and cooperation between multiple peoples. Despite the constant threat of war, New France expanded agriculturally and demographically. Settlers cleared land along the St. Lawrence River, establishing farms that provided sustenance for the growing population. Crops included wheat, oats, barley, and vegetables, supplemented by fishing and hunting. Livestock, cattle, pigs, and sheep were introduced, and European methods of construction and land use were adapted to local conditions. These settlements were small, but over time, they became resilient communities, bound together by family, faith, and shared struggle. Religion remained central to life in New France. The Jesuits, Recollets, and other missionaries continued to travel into indigenous territories, documenting languages, cultures, and spiritual practices while attempting to convert communities to Christianity. Their writings, now preserved in the Jesuit Relations, provide an extraordinary window into the lives of both indigenous peoples and French settlers, detailing seasonal movements, rituals, and the daily challenges of life in the wilderness. Missionaries often faced hardship, isolation, and even violence, but their efforts reinforced the cultural and spiritual framework of the colony. By the early 18th century, the population of New France was still modest compared to the British colonies, but it was growing steadily. Families multiplied, settlers established villages, and the cultural identity of the colony took shape. French language, Catholic faith, legal codes, and social customs became entrenched, laying the foundation for the distinct Francophone identity that persists in Quebec and beyond. However, this growth was constrained by geography, harsh winters, and the constant threat of war. The climax of these decades of tension arrived with the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, a global conflict in which New France became one of many theaters. Known in North America as the French and Indian War, it pitted French forces and their indigenous allies against British troops and colonial militias. Battles were fought along rivers, through forests, and at fortified towns. Quebec City became the focal point of a decisive confrontation in 1759 when British General James Wolfe led an assault culminating in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Both Wolfe and the French commander, Marquis de Montcalm, died in the battle, a dramatic symbol of the high stakes and personal costs of colonial warfare. The fall of Quebec signaled the beginning of the end for New France. Over the next few years, British forces captured Montreal and effectively dismantled French control over Canada. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris formally ended French rule, ceding New France to Britain. While the treaty transferred political authority, the French-speaking population remained, preserving language, culture, religion, and legal traditions. This continuity would have lasting significance, shaping Canadian identity and creating a foundation for the coexistence of French and English communities. During this century of growth and conflict, New France had transformed from a fragile settlement at Quebec into a structured colony with settlements, trade networks, military fortifications, and a distinct culture. It was a world defined by interconnectedness, struggle, and adaptation, where European ambition met the realities of the land and the agency of indigenous nations. The fur trade, religious mission, settlement expansion, and military conflict all intertwined to create a complex and resilient society, one capable of surviving in the midst of imperial rivalries and natural challenges. This era illustrates the duality of New France, a colony constantly under threat, yet steadily consolidating a place of opportunity and danger, of diplomacy and war where the fate of empires and the lives of ordinary settlers were inextricably linked. Its legacy would not disappear with British conquest. Instead, it would endure through language, culture, law, and the memories of those who lived through this century of extraordinary challenge. The year 1763 marked a dramatic turning point in the history of what would become Canada. The Treaty of Paris had ended the 7 Years' War, ceding New France to Britain and establishing British sovereignty over a vast, resource-rich territory. For the French-speaking population of Quebec and the surrounding regions, this was a moment of profound uncertainty. They were now subjects of a foreign crown, bound by new laws, new governors, and the looming presence of English-speaking settlers. Yet amidst this change, life adapted. French language, Catholic faith, and local customs persisted, forming the foundation for a society that would endure even under British rule. The British faced the immense challenge of administering a land with a diverse population and vast distances. Their approach combined political pragmatism with imperial authority. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 sought to organize the territory, drawing a boundary known as the Proclamation Line to limit European settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and ostensibly protect indigenous lands. It was also a means to consolidate governance, regulate trade, and prevent unrest in newly acquired territories. While intended to stabilize the region, the proclamation sowed seeds of tension, particularly with settlers eager to expand westward. In the decades that followed, waves of British and American settlers began to arrive. The most significant influx came in the wake of the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. Loyalists, colonists who had remained faithful to the British crown, faced persecution and dispossession in the newly independent United States. Thousands fled north, seeking refuge in Upper Canada, modern Ontario, and the Maritimes, reshaping the demographic and cultural landscape. These loyalists brought English law, Protestant faith, and a deep sense of loyalty to Britain, creating new communities and institutions that would influence Canadian development for generations. Settlement patterns transformed rapidly. Land grants were distributed to loyalists as compensation for their losses, and new towns and farms sprouted along rivers and lakes, often on lands traditionally used by Indigenous peoples. Agriculture expanded, introducing European crops, livestock, and farming techniques, while trade networks adapted to the changing populations. Timber, furs, and fish remained important, but the Loyalists also contributed to emerging local economies, governance structures, and cultural institutions. Indigenous nations, however, faced increasing displacement and pressure. Treaties were negotiated, sometimes voluntarily, often under duress, to allow European settlement, creating long-lasting impacts on traditional territories and ways of life. Nations such as the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Mi'kmaq, and Anishinaabe were compelled to navigate a shifting political landscape, balancing relations with British authorities, European settlers, and neighboring Indigenous groups. Their resilience and strategic diplomacy were critical in preserving communities and asserting autonomy, even as European expansion increasingly encroached on their lands. Political life in British North America was evolving. Governors, councils, and legislative assemblies were established to manage the colonies, balancing imperial authority with local needs. Conflicts over land, trade, and governance occasionally erupted into unrest, but they also laid the groundwork for a culture of negotiation, law, and emerging political identity. Newspapers, petitions, and debates became tools through which settlers asserted their rights, sought representation, and influenced policy. This period also witnessed cultural blending and tension. French and English settlers lived alongside one another, while Indigenous nations maintained long-standing traditions and territories. Marriages, trade, and daily interactions created networks of cooperation, but language, religion, and differing legal systems sometimes caused friction. The colony was a mosaic of peoples navigating coexistence under a single imperial authority, a dynamic that would shape Canada's identity for centuries. Military preparedness remained a central concern. Even under British control, the northern colonies were vulnerable to external threats, particularly from the United States, which now existed as a separate republic. Border disputes, trade conflicts, and military skirmishes underscored the precariousness of the region. In response, local militias were organized, forts maintained, and alliances with Indigenous nations strengthened, reflecting the ongoing strategic importance of Canada in imperial calculations. Economically, the colonies diversified. Agriculture grew in sophistication, while fur trade networks continued to link remote regions to European markets. Fishing, timber, and emerging manufacturing provided livelihoods for settlers, and trade routes expanded along rivers and lakes. The Loyalists' arrival accelerated the establishment of towns, roads, and ports, laying the infrastructure for future economic growth and integration with global markets. The period leading up to the War of 1812 saw the colonies increasingly assert their own identity while remaining loyal to Britain. English and French populations, along with Indigenous nations, navigated an intricate web of allegiance, culture, and survival. Political discussions, military preparedness, and economic expansion reflected a society in transition, one no longer defined solely by European conquest. but by adaptation to the realities of North America's geography, peoples, and ambitions. Cultural life evolved alongside these changes. Religious institutions, Catholic, Anglican, and Protestant, played central roles in education, social services, and community cohesion. Schools, churches, and communal gatherings became venues for cultural transmission, helping settlers and indigenous peoples maintain traditions while adapting to new circumstances. Social norms, customs, and legal frameworks evolved, reflecting the complex interaction of multiple cultures under British rule. This era also emphasized the resilience and agency of individuals and communities. Settlers faced harsh winters, uncertain harvests, and the constant threat of conflict, yet they built homes, farms, and communities. Indigenous nations negotiated treaties, defended their lands, and sought alliances to maintain autonomy. The Loyalists, uprooted from their homes in the South, reconstructed lives and communities in unfamiliar territories. Each group contributed to a mosaic of experience, resilience, and adaptation that defined British North America. By the early 19th century, British North America was a collection of colonies linked by geography, governance, and shared experience, yet diverse in culture, language, and legal traditions. French Canadians continued to preserve their language, religion, and identity under British rule. Loyalists had established communities along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Maritimes, embedding English law and Protestant culture. Indigenous nations remained vital players, navigating colonial pressures while sustaining cultural practices and territorial claims. This period, from 1763 to 1812, set the stage for the coming decades of conflict, negotiation, and eventual nation-building. The colonies were simultaneously adapting to British sovereignty, integrating new settlers, and responding to geopolitical pressures from the United States and Europe. The land itself, rivers, forests, and fertile valleys, shaped settlement, trade, and military strategy, reinforcing the central role of geography in the story of Canada. The arrival of the Loyalists also intensified demographic and political changes. Their influx increased the population in Upper Canada and the Maritimes, creating new political demands and social structures. Land was allocated according to rank and loyalty, sometimes displacing existing residents or indigenous communities. Infrastructure such as roads, ports, and settlements expanded rapidly, reflecting both the practical needs of settlers and the strategic interests of the British Crown. Trade, diplomacy, and alliances were crucial to the colony's survival and growth. French Canadians maintained fur trade connections with indigenous nations, while Loyalists and British authorities facilitated commerce in timber, agriculture, and shipping. The colonies were no longer isolated pockets of settlement. They were integrated into regional, continental, and global networks, connected to European markets, imperial policies, and indigenous economies. By 1812, British North America was a mosaic of cultures, economies, and political systems, united under the Crown but constantly negotiating its future. The colony's diverse populations had developed institutions, trade networks, and alliances that would endure through war, migration, and political change. It was a land of resilience, adaptation, and emerging identity, where the foundations of modern Canada, French and English coexistence, indigenous agency, and colonial governance were firmly in place. As the colonies of British North America entered the early 19th century, The delicate balance established in the aftermath of the American Revolution faced a stern test. Across the southern border, the United States had matured into a nation seeking to expand its territory, its trade networks, and its influence. Northern colonies, home to French Canadians, Loyalists, and Indigenous allies, now confronted the reality that their security, economy, and very identity depended on both loyalty to Britain and the capacity for self-defense. This tension erupted into conflict with the War of 1812, a war that would leave an indelible mark on the emerging sense of Canadian identity. The war was ignited by multiple factors: American ambitions to annex British North American territories, disputes over trade and maritime rights, and the ongoing legacy of frontier conflicts. In June 1812, the United States declared war on Britain, believing that capturing parts of Upper Canada would be swift and decisive. What followed, however, was far more complex. Canadian militias, British regulars, and Indigenous allies mounted a determined defense, exploiting their intimate knowledge of rivers, forests, and settlements. Battles unfolded along the Niagara frontier, the St. Lawrence River, and in the wilderness of Upper and Lower Canada, where mobility, strategy, and local knowledge often outweighed numerical superiority. Indigenous nations played a crucial role in these campaigns. Tecumseh, leader of a confederacy of Indigenous nations, allied with the British and Canadian militias to resist American expansion. His forces provided critical intelligence, strategic insight, and manpower, conducting raids, defending settlements, and shaping the outcome of key engagements. Tecumseh's vision extended beyond immediate military concerns. He sought to establish a united Indigenous buffer capable of resisting encroachment, preserving land, and maintaining sovereignty. Though he would fall at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, his legacy left an enduring imprint on both Indigenous and colonial history. The battles themselves were brutal and unpredictable. From the Siege of Detroit to the skirmishes along the Niagara River, the war demonstrated the challenges of fighting in a vast and rugged land. Soldiers and militias faced severe winters, treacherous rivers, and supply shortages, while civilian populations endured the disruption of homes, farms, and trade. Fortifications, such as Fort York and Fort George, became strategic points of defense, shaping both military strategy and settlement patterns. Though the war did not result in territorial changes, it fostered a sense of unity among the colonies. English and French settlers, Indigenous allies, and British forces recognized that survival depended on cooperation and collective action. Militias became more organized, local leadership structures strengthened, and the shared experience of defending the land began to create a nascent Canadian consciousness, a sense of belonging and identity that transcended individual communities. Following the war, the colonies faced a period of political and economic adjustment. The experience of defending their homes reinforced the desire for greater self-governance, even under British authority. In Lower Canada, French Canadians sought protection for language, religion, and legal traditions, while in Upper Canada, English-speaking settlers pushed for political reform and representation. These tensions manifested in the rebellions of 1837 to 1838, where frustrations with unresponsive colonial governments led to uprisings in both regions. Though suppressed, the rebellions revealed deep-seated desires for reform, accountability, and a political system that reflected local realities. Economic development during this period accelerated. Canals, roads, and early railways expanded trade between communities and with Britain. Agriculture grew more sophisticated, with wheat, barley, and livestock sustaining both local populations and exports. Timber and fur trade remained vital, while emerging industries such as shipbuilding, milling, and small-scale manufacturing diversified the economy. Cities like Montreal, Quebec City, Toronto, and Halifax became commercial hubs, reflecting the growing complexity and interconnectedness of colonial life. The period also witnessed continued settlement and negotiation with indigenous nations. Treaties and land agreements often favored European expansion, displacing indigenous communities and reshaping traditional territories. At the same time, indigenous groups actively negotiated, adapted, and resisted, maintaining cultural practices and political influence despite the pressures of colonial settlement. Their presence remained central to the social, economic, and military landscape of the colonies. Cultural and social life evolved alongside political and economic changes. Education became a focus, with schools and institutions serving both settler and indigenous populations, often under religious guidance. Churches, religious orders, and community organizations provided social cohesion, moral frameworks, and opportunities for literacy and learning. French and English communities maintained distinct traditions, while increasing interaction encouraged gradual exchange of ideas, practices, and skills. By the mid-19th century, discussions of uniting the colonies gained traction. Political reformers recognized that shared challenges, security, trade, infrastructure, and governance, required cooperation across the colonies. Ideas of confederation were debated, emphasizing compromise between French and English communities, local autonomy, and centralized governance to facilitate defense and economic growth. The experiences of war, rebellion, and settlement had demonstrated that the colonies could endure hardship, navigate complexity, and negotiate competing interests, a foundation upon which nationhood could be imagined. The period from 1812 to 1860 was thus one of transformation and identity formation. Canadians, broadly defined, had endured external threats, internal uprisings, and environmental challenges. They had built militias, negotiated treaties, developed trade networks, and expanded settlements across a vast and diverse land. In doing so, they cultivated a sense of resilience, shared purpose, and emerging self-determination. This era also underscored the continuing interplay of European imperial ambition, indigenous agency, and settler society. Indigenous nations navigated new treaties and alliances, asserting autonomy and negotiating survival in an era dominated by colonial expansion. French Canadians preserved language, law, and culture under British sovereignty. English-speaking settlers sought political reform, economic opportunity, and security. Together, these groups shaped the evolving landscape of what would become Canada, a land defined by negotiation, adaptation, and enduring diversity. Urban and rural life reflected these dynamics. Small towns grew along trade routes, rivers, and lakes, while farms spread across fertile valleys. Roads and canals improved transportation, connecting settlements and facilitating commerce. Social structures evolved, blending European norms with local adaptations. Communities were organized around family, trade, religion, and local governance, creating the foundations of civic life that would later underpin the Canadian state. By 1860, the stage was set for the next critical phase, the unification of the colonies into a single political entity. The lessons of war, rebellion, and settlement had demonstrated the importance of unity, strategic planning, and compromise. Political discussions increasingly focused on confederation, infrastructure, and economic integration, laying the groundwork for the birth of the Dominion of Canada. By the mid-19th century, the colonies of British North America had matured into diverse, complex societies. The experiences of war, migration, settlement, and political reform had shaped distinct identities in Upper and Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the other territories. Yet, the practical challenges of defense, economic development, and governance loomed large. In this context, political leaders and visionaries began to explore the idea of uniting the colonies under a single federal structure, an idea that would transform the map of North America and redefine what it meant to be Canadian. On July 1st, 1867, that vision became reality. The British North America Act, passed by the British Parliament, created the Dominion of Canada, uniting Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia into a single federal entity. Confederation represented a careful balance. It was a union designed to preserve local authority while providing a centralized government capable of defense, economic planning, and negotiation with Britain. It was a union of compromise, reflecting the complex realities of language, religion, and culture in a diverse set of colonies. At the heart of Confederation was the challenge of balancing French and English interests. In Quebec, French Canadians sought to protect their language, Catholic faith, and civil law traditions. In Ontario, English-speaking settlers demanded local governance and representation. The federal structure addressed these needs through the division of powers, granting provinces control over local matters while centralizing defense, trade, and foreign relations. This model of governance would become a defining feature of Canadian political life, enabling the coexistence of multiple identities within a single nation. Expansion was central to the new Dominion. In the years following 1867, additional provinces joined Confederation. Manitoba entered in 1870 following the Red River Rebellion, a complex episode in which Louis Riel and the Métis people asserted their rights to land, culture, and political representation. British Columbia joined in 1871, motivated by promises of a transcontinental railway linking the Pacific coast to eastern Canada, reflecting the strategic importance of transportation and commerce. Prince Edward Island followed in 1873, drawn into the Union through financial incentives and political negotiations. These expansions transformed the Dominion into a continental nation, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and reinforced the need for infrastructure, governance, and Indigenous negotiation across vast distances. The westward expansion was not without conflict and consequence. Indigenous nations faced displacement and marginalization as treaties were negotiated, often under pressure with the federal government. The Métis, First Nations, and Inuit navigated an era of increasing settlement, resource exploitation, and loss of autonomy. Louis Riel's leadership during the Red River Rebellion highlighted the tensions between Indigenous and Métis communities and the new Dominion government. While Riel's provisional government achieved some concessions, including recognition of land rights and cultural protections, it also underscored the power imbalance inherent in colonial expansion. Economic development during this period was both rapid and transformative. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885 was a monumental achievement, linking east and west, facilitating trade, migration, and military mobility, and cementing Canada's territorial integrity. Railroads opened the prairies to settlement, enabling farmers from eastern Canada, the United States, and Europe to cultivate land on a massive scale. Timber, mining, and fisheries became integral components of regional economies, connecting local production to national and international markets. The Dominion was no longer a loose collection of colonies. It was emerging as a single economic and political entity with continental reach. Cities and towns grew alongside the infrastructure. Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa expanded as administrative, commercial, and cultural hubs. Western settlements, including Winnipeg and Regina, emerged along railway lines, often displacing Indigenous communities and reshaping the landscape. Urbanization brought challenges as well as opportunities. Public services, education, law enforcement, and commerce had to adapt to rapidly growing populations. Immigration policies encouraged settlement from Europe, bringing new cultures, languages, and traditions into the fabric of Canadian society. Political life matured in parallel with expansion. The parliamentary system, inherited from Britain, was adapted to Canadian circumstances, balancing executive authority with elected representation. Debates over provincial versus federal powers, language rights, and Indigenous relations dominated political discourse. Leaders like John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, navigated these challenges, pursuing policies that promoted unity while attempting to reconcile competing interests across provinces and populations. Culturally, Canada was evolving. French and English communities negotiated coexistence through institutions, language policies, and education. Indigenous peoples engaged in a complex process of adaptation, resistance, and negotiation, asserting rights to land, culture, and political recognition. European immigrants introduced new customs, religions, and economic practices, while the existing populations of Loyalists, French Canadians, and Métis contributed to a uniquely Canadian identity that was both diverse and unified. The period from 1867 to 1885 was also marked by social transformation. Education systems expanded, literacy rates improved, and religious and civic institutions provided stability and cohesion. Settlers adapted European practices to the North American environment, integrating local knowledge from Indigenous peoples into agriculture, hunting, and navigation. Communities became more interconnected through roads, telegraphs, and railways, reflecting the increasing complexity of a rapidly modernizing society. Yet the creation and expansion of the Dominion were not simply administrative or economic achievements. They were exercises in negotiation, compromise, and identity formation. The Confederation required reconciling regional differences, cultural diversity, and the legacies of colonial conflict. It demanded diplomacy with Indigenous nations, strategic planning for territorial integration, and careful attention to the aspirations of settlers from varied backgrounds. These challenges shaped the early Canadian state, leaving a legacy of federalism, multiculturalism, and political pragmatism that endures today. By the end of 1885, the Dominion of Canada was a nation in formation, territorially vast, and culturally complex. Provinces and territories were connected by railways and trade networks, political institutions were established, and communities were increasingly linked by commerce, communication, and shared governance. At the same time, indigenous nations were navigating new realities imposed by settlement and federal policies, asserting rights and negotiating survival in the face of expanding European populations. This period demonstrated that nationhood is never instantaneous. Confederation was not the conclusion of Canada's story. It was the beginning of a new chapter in which governance, expansion, economic development, and cultural negotiation would define the trajectory of a young nation. The Dominion of Canada emerged as a union of compromises, alliances, and strategies designed to navigate the challenges of geography, demography, and diversity, while laying the groundwork for the social, political, and economic evolution that would follow. By the late 19th century, the Dominion of Canada was undergoing a profound transformation. The country that had emerged from Confederation was now expanding westward, industrializing rapidly, and integrating waves of immigrants into its growing economy. The period from 1885 to 1914 was one of both opportunity and tension, a time when Canada began to assert its place as a modern nation while grappling with the consequences of expansion, social change, and cultural negotiation. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, in 1885 was a landmark achievement, linking the Atlantic provinces with the Pacific coast and transforming the geography of possibility. Before the railway, travel and trade across the vast expanses of Canada had been slow, uncertain, and perilous. The CPR not only facilitated the movement of goods and people, but also symbolized the unity of a nation stretching from coast to coast. For settlers, the railway opened the prairies to large-scale agriculture. For industry, it provided a channel to move timber, minerals, and manufactured goods to domestic and international markets. The prairies, in particular, became a focal point for agricultural expansion. Fertile soil, temperate summers, and new technology, steel plows, threshing machines, and mechanized harvesters, allowed settlers to cultivate wheat, oats, and barley on an unprecedented scale. Immigration policies, often guided by the federal government, encouraged settlers from Europe, particularly from the British Isles, Germany, Ukraine, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe, to establish farms across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. These new arrivals brought their cultures, languages, and agricultural knowledge, reshaping the demographic and cultural landscape of Western Canada. Yet the expansion came at a heavy cost for Indigenous communities. Treaties, often negotiated under duress or through coercive means, opened lands for European settlement while undermining Indigenous sovereignty. Traditional hunting grounds were fragmented, buffalo populations dwindled, and Indigenous economies and social structures were disrupted. The residential school system, which had been established earlier but expanded during this period, forced Indigenous children into assimilation, stripping them of language, culture, and family connections. These policies left enduring scars that continue to affect Indigenous communities today, highlighting the dark side of Canada's rapid modernization. Industrial growth was not limited to agriculture. Urban centers experienced unprecedented expansion as factories, mills, and resource-based industries multiplied. Cities such as Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, and Vancouver became hubs of commerce, finance, and labor. Timber, mining, and steel production fueled industrialization, while new technologies, electricity, telegraphs, and railroads redefined communication, transportation, and daily life. Urbanization created opportunities for work, innovation, and upward mobility, but also produced challenges. Overcrowding, labor disputes, poor sanitation, and social inequality became pressing concerns. Immigration and urbanization brought cultural diversity alongside social tension. Eastern European, Italian, and Chinese immigrants contributed labor to railways, mines, and factories, while also maintaining cultural traditions, language, and religious practices. Anti-immigrant sentiment, discriminatory laws, and exclusionary policies reflected the anxieties of established communities struggling to integrate newcomers. Chinese immigrants, for example, faced the Chinese head tax and restrictive legislation that limited family reunification and opportunities, illustrating the systemic barriers embedded in Canada's economic and social expansion. Railway expansion and industrial growth also strengthened Canada's strategic position and national cohesion. The CPR allowed the government to assert authority over distant territories, facilitated military mobility, and enhanced trade with the United States and Britain. Economic integration tied provinces and regions together, creating a sense of interdependence that transcended local identities. The physical connectivity provided by railroads mirrored the political and cultural connectivity of a nation increasingly aware of its collective potential. Politically, the period was marked by debates over federal authority, provincial rights, and Indigenous relations. Leaders navigated the challenges of uniting a geographically and culturally diverse country while responding to local concerns. Issues of language, religion, and education remained contentious, particularly in Quebec, where French Canadians sought to preserve culture and autonomy within the expanding Dominion. Similarly, the governance of Western territories required negotiation with settlers, Indigenous nations, and immigrant communities, reflecting the delicate balance between expansion and equitable administration. Economic policy emphasized resource development and trade expansion. Lumber, minerals, and agricultural products became central to national and international markets. The Dominion encouraged settlement with land grants, credit, and infrastructure support, aiming to create a self-sustaining economy. Banking institutions, stock exchanges, and trade networks developed alongside industry, reflecting the maturation of Canada's economic system. This combination of industrialization, infrastructure, and immigration positioned Canada as a country poised for global relevance, even as internal challenges persisted. Social life evolved alongside these economic and demographic changes. Education expanded, including both public schools and religiously affiliated institutions, shaping literacy, civic identity, and professional skills. Community organizations, clubs, and civic societies provided venues for cultural exchange, social cohesion, and political engagement. Newspapers and periodicals proliferated, reflecting both the diversity of perspectives and the increasing importance of public discourse in shaping national identity. The period also emphasized adaptation to the environment and geography. Settlers learned to farm in prairie conditions, withstand harsh winters, and navigate rivers and mountains for trade and travel. Indigenous knowledge, often ignored or marginalized, had previously guided survival in these lands, but European settlers increasingly relied on technology, railways, and mechanized agriculture to transform the landscape. Environmental transformation was profound. Forests were cleared, wetlands drained, and river systems modified, altering ecosystems and reshaping Canada's natural heritage. Cultural identity during this era was complex and multifaceted. French Canadians in Quebec continued to assert their language, law, and religion as central elements of community life. English-speaking settlers emphasized loyalty to the British Crown, participation in emerging national institutions, and integration into the expanding economy. Immigrants from Europe and Asia negotiated dual pressures, preserving cultural heritage while adapting to the economic and political realities of the Dominion. This interplay of continuity and change shaped the social fabric of Canada, creating both cohesion and tension. By 1914, Canada had become a nation of contrasts. Urban industrial centers and rural settlements, Indigenous territories and settler farms, European immigrants and French and English communities all coexisted in a dynamic, sometimes tense, relationship. The infrastructure of railways, roads, and communications links regions, facilitating trade, governance, and cultural exchange. Economic expansion provided opportunity, but also highlighted inequality. Social change challenged traditional hierarchies, while political discourse increasingly emphasized representation, rights, and national development. This period of industrialization and immigration laid the foundation for Canada's emergence on the global stage. Economic growth, population expansion, and territorial integration strengthened the Dominion's capacity for self-determination and international engagement. At the same time, the legacy of displacement, inequality, and cultural negotiation revealed the costs of rapid transformation, a tension between progress and justice that would continue to shape Canadian society in the decades to come. As the world plunged into World War I in 1914, Canada, still a dominion of the British Empire, was drawn inexorably into the conflict. The outbreak of war was both a call to duty and a test of national identity. Thousands of Canadian men volunteered to serve overseas, motivated by loyalty to Britain, a sense of adventure, and a growing awareness of Canada as a distinct nation. The war would profoundly shape the country's identity, politics, and society, marking Canada's emergence onto the global stage. From the outset, Canada's contribution was significant. The Canadian Expeditionary Force mobilized quickly, deploying to Europe to fight alongside British and Allied troops. The war was brutal, fought in the trenches of France and Belgium, where mud, disease, and relentless artillery created a landscape of devastation. Canadians gained a reputation for resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity, qualities that would become central to the national narrative. The Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917 was a turning point both militarily and symbolically. For the first time, all 4 Canadian divisions fought together under Canadian command, meticulously planning and executing an assault against well-fortified German positions. The victory, achieved at a high human cost, became emblematic of Canadian courage, unity, and emerging autonomy. Veterans returning home carried with them a sense of pride and the knowledge that Canada could act decisively on the world stage, even while still formally under British sovereignty. The home front was equally transformed. The war effort demanded unprecedented mobilization of resources, labor, and social cooperation. Women entered factories, farms, and offices in large numbers, taking on roles traditionally held by men, a shift that challenged social norms and expanded the boundaries of gender roles in Canadian society. Industries adapted to meet military needs, producing munitions, ships, and supplies, while agriculture intensified to feed troops abroad. The economy became increasingly integrated into global networks, reflecting Canada's growing participation in international affairs. The human cost of war was immense. Tens of thousands of Canadians perished, while countless more returned home with physical injuries and psychological trauma. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 compounded these challenges, killing thousands across the country and leaving communities to grapple with grief, disruption, and uncertainty. Social structures were strained, yet the collective experience fostered a stronger sense of national cohesion, as Canadians recognized shared sacrifice and responsibility. In the interwar years, Canada sought to assert greater autonomy and influence in global affairs. The country participated in the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, signing the Treaty of Versailles as a separate entity alongside Britain. This recognition of Canada as a sovereign participant on the world stage marked a critical step toward full political independence, establishing a precedent for future international engagement. Domestically, veterans returned to communities transformed by war, demanding pensions, employment, and recognition, shaping both social policy and political discourse. Economically, the 1920s and 1930s were a period of uneven growth. The post-war boom brought industrial expansion, urbanization, and technological innovation, while the Great Depression of the 1930s inflicted widespread hardship. Unemployment soared, businesses collapsed, and farmers struggled with declining commodity prices. Relief programs, public works, and social policy interventions became essential tools for survival, highlighting the evolving role of government in safeguarding citizens and stabilizing the economy. As global tensions rose in the late 1930s, Canada once again faced the specter of war. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the country was drawn into conflict, this time with greater autonomy. Canada declared war on Germany independently, emphasizing its status as a sovereign nation while maintaining ties to Britain. Over 1 million Canadians served in the armed forces, participating in campaigns across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Canadian soldiers, sailors, and airmen distinguished themselves in battles such as Dieppe, 1942, Ortona, 1943, and the Normandy landings, 1944, earning a reputation for courage, skill, and tenacity. The home front during World War II was equally transformative. Industries shifted to wartime production, creating jobs and accelerating technological innovation. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, serving in munitions factories, hospitals, and administrative roles, further challenging traditional gender norms. Immigration policies adapted to support the war effort, while rationing, war bonds, and volunteer organizations mobilized communities in support of soldiers overseas. The war reshaped Canadian society, fostering unity while also exposing inequalities that would inform post-war reforms. Canada's contributions extended beyond the battlefield. The country became a hub for training Allied airmen, hosting bases under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which played a crucial role in the Allied war effort. Canadian forces also participated in naval convoys across the Atlantic, protecting vital supply lines from German U-boats, demonstrating the nation's strategic significance in global military operations. Indigenous peoples participated in both world wars, serving in the military while navigating systemic discrimination at home. Their service challenged prevailing social hierarchies and laid the groundwork for later advocacy for rights and recognition. Similarly, minority communities faced both opportunities and barriers as they contributed to the war effort, highlighting the complexities of social inclusion in a diverse, evolving nation. Politically, the war years catalyzed change. Canada's participation in World War II fostered international recognition and strengthened claims to sovereignty, setting the stage for post-war independence and participation in emerging global institutions. Domestically, debates over conscription, resource allocation, and social policy highlighted tensions between federal authority, provincial autonomy, and citizen expectations. These discussions reflected the growing maturity of Canada's democratic institutions and the negotiation of identity within a complex federation. Economically, wartime mobilization transformed Canada into a modern industrial power. Manufacturing, mining, and energy sectors expanded dramatically, creating employment and technological advancements. Cities swelled as workers moved from rural areas to urban centers, reinforcing patterns of industrialization and urbanization that had begun decades earlier. Infrastructure investments, including roads, ports, and communication networks, laid the foundation for post-war economic growth and integration. Culturally, the wars reinforced a sense of national identity and pride. Commemorations, memorials, and public narratives celebrated the sacrifices of soldiers and civilians alike. Literature, music, and visual arts reflected both the trauma and the heroism of the era, documenting experiences and shaping collective memory. Veterans organizations and civic groups fostered community engagement, advocacy, and remembrance, embedding wartime experiences into the fabric of Canadian society. By 1945, Canada had emerged transformed. From the trenches of Europe to the factories of Montreal and Toronto, the country had asserted itself on the global stage, developed a modern economy, and cultivated a national identity rooted in resilience, cooperation, and shared sacrifice. The experiences of World War I and World War II forged a population capable of navigating the challenges of governance, social change, and international engagement. In the aftermath of World War II, Canada faced a new era of opportunity, challenge, and transformation. The nation emerged from global conflict with a sense of confidence and autonomy, having contributed significantly to Allied victories while asserting itself as a distinct actor on the world stage. Economic growth surged, cities expanded, and a new social contract began to take shape. A contract that sought to balance prosperity, equality, and national identity in an increasingly complex society. The post-war period saw unprecedented economic expansion. Industrial production, which had been honed during wartime mobilization, shifted to peacetime needs, fueling growth in manufacturing, energy, transportation, and construction. Urban centers like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Calgary experienced population booms as veterans returned home and immigrants arrived in search of opportunity. Housing developments, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects reshaped the landscape, reflecting a society rapidly transitioning from wartime austerity to peacetime modernization. Immigration played a pivotal role in shaping the nation. Canada opened its doors to European refugees, displaced persons, and skilled workers, diversifying the population and contributing to economic growth. Italians, Ukrainians, Dutch, Poles, and others settled across the country, bringing language, culture, and expertise that enriched Canadian society. Government policies encouraged settlement in urban centers and the western provinces, integrating newcomers into labor markets while gradually transforming Canada into a multicultural nation. Indigenous communities faced continuing challenges during this period. The legacy of residential schools, land displacement, and assimilation policies persisted, creating profound social and cultural disruptions. However, the post-war era also witnessed the beginnings of organized indigenous activism, as communities mobilized to assert land rights, cultural recognition, and political influence. Court cases, protests, and negotiations gradually challenged entrenched inequities, setting the stage for later reforms and reconciliation efforts. Social change was mirrored in the evolution of Canadian politics. Federal and provincial governments grappled with balancing economic development, social welfare, and regional disparities. Programs such as unemployment insurance, family allowances, and public health initiatives expanded the role of the state, reflecting the growing belief that government had a responsibility to safeguard citizens' well-being. These policies laid the foundation for Canada's emerging social safety net and influenced debates over equality, labor rights, and social justice. Cultural identity also evolved during this era. Post-war prosperity allowed Canadians to invest in education, arts, and media. Universities expanded, scientific research flourished, and cultural institutions proliferated. National symbols, narratives, and shared experiences, ranging from wartime sacrifice to industrial achievement, helped forge a sense of Canadian identity distinct from Britain and the United States. French-English relations remained central, particularly in Quebec, where debates over language, culture, and political autonomy intensified. The rise of Quebec nationalism, culminating in movements such as the Quiet Revolution, reflected broader questions about identity, governance, and the distribution of power within the Federation. The 1960s and 1970s brought further transformation. Canada navigated global political tensions, including the Cold War, while asserting its influence in international organizations such as the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Peacekeeping missions became a hallmark of Canadian foreign policy, reinforcing a reputation for diplomacy and humanitarian engagement. At home, civil rights movements, women's advocacy, and labor organizations reshaped social norms, challenging entrenched hierarchies and expanding opportunities for participation in public life. Economic development continued alongside these social changes. Natural resources, including oil, gas, and minerals, fueled industrial growth, while manufacturing and technology sectors diversified regional economies. Urbanization intensified, linking previously isolated communities through transportation networks, communication systems, and regional trade. The economic dynamism of this period provided the material basis for social programs, educational expansion, and cultural initiatives, supporting the ongoing evolution of Canadian society. The relationship with Indigenous peoples gained greater legal recognition during this era. Landmark court cases and negotiations acknowledged historical treaties, land claims, and rights to self-determination, marking a slow shift toward reconciliation and justice. Activists, scholars, and community leaders worked to preserve language, traditions, and governance structures, challenging centuries of colonial policy and reshaping public awareness of Canada's shared history and responsibilities. In 1965, Canada adopted the maple leaf flag, a visual symbol of a distinct national identity. This act was emblematic of broader efforts to define what it meant to be Canadian in a world no longer dominated by British cultural authority. National holidays, commemorations, and cultural programming reinforced a collective memory rooted in shared experience, military service, exploration, and community. Canadians increasingly saw themselves as part of a nation with its own values, history, and place on the global stage. The culmination of this period came in 1982, when Canada patriated its constitution and enacted the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, formally asserting full sovereignty from Britain. This legal milestone codified individual rights, political liberties, and protections against discrimination, reflecting decades of political evolution, social advocacy, and institutional development. The Charter symbolized Canada's commitment to pluralism, equality, and democratic governance, providing a framework for national unity while acknowledging regional and cultural diversity. Throughout these decades, Canada's demographic landscape has changed dramatically. Immigration from non-European countries began to increase, laying the groundwork for the multicultural policies of the late 20th century. Urban centers became increasingly diverse, while smaller towns and rural areas experienced population shifts that influenced economic development, education, and political representation. This demographic transformation shaped debates over identity, integration, and the meaning of citizenship as the country prepared to enter a globalized era. Technological innovation also marked this period. Advances in transportation, communication, and industry reshaped daily life, connected distant communities, and enabled new forms of economic activity. Railways, highways, and air travel facilitated trade and mobility, while telecommunication networks allowed for the rapid exchange of information and ideas. These developments contributed to the sense of national cohesion, linking regions, cultures, and economies in ways previously unimaginable. Culturally, Canada's arts, literature, and media reflected the nation's evolving identity. Writers, artists, and filmmakers explored themes of regionalism, multiculturalism, and historical memory. Public broadcasting, museums, and archives helped preserve history and cultivate civic understanding. National narratives emerged not only from government and institutions, but also from grassroots communities, Indigenous nations, and immigrant populations, reflecting the complex mosaic of Canadian experience. By 1982, Canada had transformed from a war-torn, resource-dependent dominion into a modern, multicultural, and economically diverse nation. Its population had grown, its economy had industrialized and diversified, and its political institutions had matured. Social programs, legal frameworks, and cultural initiatives strengthened national cohesion, while Indigenous activism and advocacy challenged historical injustices and laid the groundwork for ongoing reconciliation. The country was increasingly confident in its sovereignty, capable of navigating global politics, and attentive to its internal diversity and regional differences. The patriation of Canada's Constitution in 1982, along with the adoption of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, marked the culmination of centuries of legal and political evolution. Yet, this was not an endpoint. It was the beginning of a new chapter in which Canada would navigate the complexities of multiculturalism, Indigenous reconciliation, economic integration, environmental stewardship, and technological transformation. Over the decades that followed, Canada evolved into a nation increasingly confident in its sovereignty, globally engaged, and attentive to the diversity of its people. One of the defining features of contemporary Canada has been its multicultural identity. Immigration policies adopted in the 1960s and 1970s were expanded and refined, attracting people from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and other urban centers became global cities, hosting a mosaic of languages, religions, and cultures. This demographic transformation reshaped social institutions, workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods, challenging Canadians to redefine national identity in a way that embraced diversity while fostering social cohesion. Policies promoting multiculturalism, bilingualism, and anti-discrimination were enacted, reflecting a national commitment to inclusion and equity. Indigenous nations continued to assert rights, sovereignty, and cultural preservation in this era. Landmark legal decisions, land claim settlements, and negotiations with the federal government recognized treaties and affirmed rights to self-determination. Activists and leaders, including those from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, campaigned for recognition of historical injustices, compensation for residential schools, and protection of land and resources. Cultural revitalization movements, language preservation programs, and governance initiatives strengthened Indigenous communities, while ongoing advocacy highlighted the continuing challenges of reconciling colonial legacies with modern nationhood. Economically, Canada faced both opportunities and challenges. The late 20th century witnessed globalization, technological innovation, and the rise of service and knowledge economies. Trade agreements, such as the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, 1989, and later NAFTA, 1994, integrated Canada more deeply into continental and global markets. Manufacturing, resource extraction, and energy sectors adapted to international competition, while financial services, technology, and research became increasingly central to the economy. Urban centers grew as economic hubs, drawing domestic and international migration, while rural areas adapted to changing industries and global market pressures. Political life in contemporary Canada has reflected a delicate balance of federalism, regional interests, and cultural diversity. The Quebec sovereignty movement reached a critical juncture in the 1995 referendum, narrowly rejecting secession but underscoring enduring tensions over language, identity, and governance. Indigenous governance and self-determination also reshaped political discourse, with agreements such as the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, 1993, creating new territorial governance structures. These developments highlighted Canada's ongoing efforts to reconcile competing historical, cultural, and geographic imperatives within a unified federation. Socially, Canada has expanded access to education, healthcare, and social services, reflecting a commitment to equity and opportunity. Public healthcare systems, universal education, and social programs have evolved to accommodate a changing population and address the challenges of an aging society. Programs supporting women's participation in the workforce, anti-discrimination legislation, and initiatives for marginalized communities have reshaped public life, reflecting the nation's values of equality and social justice. Technological innovation has also defined contemporary Canada. The proliferation of computers, telecommunications, and the internet transformed communication, commerce, and education. Scientific research in energy, medicine, environmental science, and information technology position Canada as a participant in the global knowledge economy. Urban planning, infrastructure development, and digital connectivity reshaped cities, linking communities and fostering national cohesion through shared access to information and services. Environmental concerns emerged as a central theme in public policy and national discourse. Climate change, resource management, and conservation became critical issues as Canadians confronted the consequences of industrialization, urbanization, and global environmental pressures. National parks, protected areas, and sustainability initiatives reflected both ecological awareness and the recognition of the intrinsic value of Canada's natural landscapes. Indigenous knowledge and stewardship played an increasing role in environmental management, contributing perspectives rooted in centuries of experience with the land. Cultural identity continued to evolve. Literature, film, music, and visual arts reflected regional diversity, historical memory, and contemporary experience. Canadian narratives explored themes of migration, colonial legacy, reconciliation, and the tension between urban modernity and rural tradition. National celebrations, commemorations, and civic programs emphasized shared history and collective responsibility, reinforcing a sense of belonging in a society marked by diversity and change. Canada's role in international affairs expanded significantly during this period. Peacekeeping, diplomacy, and humanitarian engagement became defining features of Canadian foreign policy. The country participated in United Nations missions, NATO operations, and global initiatives addressing development, security, and human rights. Canada's foreign policy emphasized collaboration, multilateralism, and the protection of democratic values, reflecting both historical ties to Britain and an independent approach to global engagement. Economic globalization also shaped domestic policy. Trade liberalization, market integration, and technological innovation provided opportunities but also created vulnerabilities. Canadians adapted through workforce development, education, and regional economic strategies, while governments negotiated policies to balance national interests with global realities. Immigration policy continued to attract skilled workers and foster cultural diversity, reinforcing economic competitiveness while enriching social life. Health, education, and social welfare evolved to meet the needs of a diverse and aging population. Public healthcare systems expanded access to services, while initiatives in early childhood education, post-secondary education, and vocational training strengthened human capital. Social equity programs addressed systemic inequalities, and policies supporting women, Indigenous peoples, and minority communities contributed to a more inclusive society. By the early 21st century, Canada had emerged as a modern, multicultural, and globally engaged nation. Its cities were hubs of innovation and diversity, its regions linked through transportation and communication networks, and its institutions strengthened by legal protections, social programs, and political negotiation. Indigenous reconciliation, environmental stewardship, and cultural integration remained central to national identity, reflecting the ongoing evolution of a country shaped by centuries of exploration, settlement, conflict, and compromise. Technological advances continued to reshape Canadian life. The rise of digital communication, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy has transformed work, education, and governance. Canadians engaged with global networks while maintaining local and regional identities, navigating the tension between integration and autonomy. Social movements, advocacy, and civic engagement reflected an active citizenry invested in shaping the nation's future while confronting historical and contemporary challenges. Through the decades since 1982, Canada has grappled with the legacies of its past while embracing the possibilities of the present and future. The nation's Indigenous peoples, immigrant communities, French and English populations, and global partners have contributed to a mosaic of identity, governance, and cultural expression. Contemporary Canada is defined by its commitment to diversity, equity, and participation, reflecting centuries of negotiation, adaptation, and resilience. From the fleeting Norse settlements in Vinland to the bustling multicultural cities of the 21st century, the history of Canada is a story of exploration, resilience, adaptation, and negotiation. Every phase of this history reveals a delicate balance between human ambition, environmental constraints, and the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples whose knowledge and culture shaped the land long before European arrival. The Norse explorations around 1000 CE represent the earliest recorded European encounters with Canadian territory. Though these settlements were temporary and fragile, they foreshadowed centuries of interaction between newcomers and the land's original inhabitants. The sagas of Leif Erikson and other explorers emphasize both opportunity and risk, the promise of resources and trade alongside the stark realities of climate, isolation, and conflict. These early voyages, though ephemeral, established the precedent for recorded history and set the stage for subsequent European exploration. Centuries later, the arrival of explorers such as John Cabot in 1497 and the subsequent French and Basque fishing expeditions initiated sustained contact between Europe and the lands that would become Canada. Trade with Indigenous nations introduced European goods and ideas, while simultaneously exposing communities to disease, displacement, and cultural disruption. These interactions created complex networks of exchange, diplomacy, and tension, highlighting the interdependence and friction that would define Canadian history for centuries. The establishment of New France in 1608, led by Samuel de Champlain, marked the beginning of permanent European settlement. Champlain's alliances with Indigenous nations such as the Huron-Wendat illustrate the interwoven nature of diplomacy, commerce, and survival in a frontier environment. The fur trade became the economic backbone of New France, while exploration of the St. Lawrence River, Great Lakes, and interior territories expanded both knowledge and influence. Yet the colony was also marked by conflict, with British colonies to the south, rival European powers, and internal challenges, which foreshadowed the struggles that would culminate in the 7 Years' War and the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The British conquest of New France fundamentally reshaped the political and cultural landscape. French Canadians retained their language, faith, and civil law, forging a society that could maintain continuity within a British-dominated empire. Simultaneously, waves of loyalist migration following the American Revolution brought English-speaking settlers to Upper Canada and the Maritimes, creating new communities, political institutions, and social tensions. Indigenous nations experienced further displacement and marginalization as treaties and land allocations expanded European settlement. The cultural and demographic complexity of Canada became increasingly pronounced, laying the groundwork for future negotiation and compromise. The 19th century witnessed both conflict and collaboration. The War of 1812 fostered a sense of unity among militias, Indigenous allies, and British troops, while rebellions in the 1830s highlighted the demand for political reform. These events set the stage for Confederation in 1867, when Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia united under a federal structure designed to balance local autonomy with national cohesion. Expansion to Manitoba, British Columbia, and Prince Edward Island, along with treaties with Indigenous nations, further defined the geographic and political shape of the Dominion. The Canadian Pacific Railway and other infrastructure projects physically and symbolically linked the nation, while urbanization and economic development transformed society. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought industrialization, immigration, and the integration of diverse communities into a growing economy. The prairies were opened to large-scale agriculture, cities became industrial hubs, and immigrant populations enriched the social and cultural fabric. Yet these advances often came at great cost to Indigenous peoples, who faced forced assimilation, residential schools, and displacement. Economic growth was accompanied by social tension, urban inequality, and environmental transformation, reflecting the dualities inherent in nation-building. Canada's emergence on the global stage was shaped by participation in World War I and World War II. The Battle of Vimy Ridge symbolized national courage and unity, while later campaigns, including Normandy and the Dieppe Raid, demonstrated military skill and strategic significance. The wars fostered international recognition, strengthened autonomy, and shaped domestic policy, while social changes, including women's expanded roles and veteran reintegration, transformed communities. These conflicts underscored Canada's capacity for self-determination, resilience, and international engagement. The post-war period emphasized economic growth, social reform, and cultural diversification. Immigration, urbanization, and industrial expansion reshaped cities and rural areas alike, while social programs, healthcare, and education strengthened civic infrastructure. Quebec nationalism, Indigenous activism, and multicultural policy reflected ongoing negotiation over identity, language, and governance. The patriation of the Constitution in 1982 and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms formalized national sovereignty, legal protections, and democratic principles, anchoring Canada's evolving identity in law and civic practice. Contemporary Canada embodies the cumulative effects of centuries of exploration, conflict, and adaptation. Multiculturalism, bilingualism, and Indigenous reconciliation remain central to national identity, while environmental stewardship, technological innovation, and global engagement define the country's modern character. Urban centers and rural landscapes coexist alongside vast wilderness, reflecting the ongoing interplay between human ambition and the natural environment. Social, cultural, and political developments highlight the persistent need for negotiation, compromise, and inclusion in a diverse society. The arc of Canadian history demonstrates that nationhood is not a single event, but a continuous process. From the first Norse voyages to modern urban landscapes, Canada's development has been shaped by migration, settlement, diplomacy, conflict, economic innovation, and cultural negotiation. Indigenous peoples, French and English communities, immigrants, and other groups have all contributed to the formation of a national identity that is dynamic, contested, and resilient. The lessons of the past, cooperation, adaptation, and recognition of diversity, continue to inform Canada's trajectory, shaping the country as it navigates the complexities of the 21st century. Canada's story is ultimately one of human ambition interacting with environment, culture, and politics. Mountains, rivers, forests, and prairies have defined possibilities for settlement, agriculture, and commerce. Indigenous knowledge guided survival and land stewardship for millennia, while European technologies and governance structures transformed landscapes and societies. Wars, treaties, and political negotiation created frameworks for coexistence, while immigration, industrialization, and cultural exchange expanded the nation's capacity for innovation, adaptation, and inclusion. Throughout its history, Canada has grappled with contradictions and tensions. Expansion often came at the expense of Indigenous sovereignty. Economic growth produced inequality alongside prosperity. Political compromise balanced local autonomy with national unity. Yet these tensions have also generated resilience, creativity, and innovation, demonstrating the capacity of a society to negotiate difference and build institutions that endure. The history of Canada, from 1000 CE to the present, reveals the cumulative effects of centuries of exploration, settlement, diplomacy, conflict, and reform. It is a history of integration and division, continuity and change, highlighting both human achievement and the costs of ambition. Each era, the Norse settlements, French and British colonial struggles, Confederation, industrialization, wars, and modern multiculturalism, contributes to the narrative of a nation defined by complexity, compromise, and enduring vision. Canada's arc is neither linear nor simple. It is a tapestry of identities, ambitions, and experiences reflecting the interplay of geography, culture, politics, and economy. Indigenous nations maintain ancestral connections to land. French and English communities preserve linguistic and legal traditions, and immigrants from around the world contribute to a continually evolving national fabric. This intricate interplay defines Canada as a nation capable of reflection, adaptation, and forward-looking growth.